Before I was a healer, I was an ethnomusicologist. And the work I do now, this strange mixture of analysis, intuition, attention, and the kind of perception that deepens when the ego quiets, began far earlier than I realized. Not in a classroom, not in a healing space, but in the field. Because the first time I truly paid attention wasn't in my research notes. It was in a room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, waiting for musicians to begin. Waiting for the invocation, the calling in of the four directions that shifted the space long before any sound was made. That was the moment I began to understand the work beneath the work. Long before I could name it, this is how I began to think about it and write about it, with my own invocation to the four directions. May 27th, 2000. To the east, beyond the edge of town, all is sky and land, blue bending down to meet undulating golden hills and sloughs that unfold into high blue sky and back again. The Great Plains of Alberta. To the west rise the northern Rockies, stark, pristine, and sublimely beautiful. South of north and north of home, I wait on the border of pure space and high drama, outside a dilapidated motel in a Mormon town, on the edge of the Kanewa Reserve. My host, Greta and Raymond, arrived in a rusty brown van, 2 hours and 17 minutes late. They didn't explain the delay, and I didn't ask. Time had its own shape in that place. They were still calling me the anthropologist, asking me pointed, music-specific questions, testing my basic knowledge, making sure I knew enough to deserve the ride. A few times, one of the women glanced at her bare wrist and asked me what time it was. A gentle hazing, a joke with layers, a test of whether I understood that clock time wasn't the dominant rhythm here. I answered politely, feigning oblivion, compounding the humor, trying not to take up space. We made a brief stop by a cemetery. Music, memory, and the land intertwined, but the heart of the night happened elsewhere. It happened in a warm, noisy home brimming with family and friends. Inside the house there was laughter, teasing, mint tea, and bologna sandwiches on trays. At one point, one of the twins brought me a drink, and I thanked him by name, except it wasn't the right twin. "Can't you tell us Indians apart? I'm not Raymond, I'm Rick." His brother emerged from the kitchen just then, the wives rolling their eyes. "Don't pay any attention to them. Twins are trouble." I blushed, laughed, tried to remember everyone. This was fieldwork, but it was also initiation. A softening of the edges between outsider and participants. Finally, Olivia Tailfeathers reminded us why we were there. "It's time to sing," she said. Someone handed me a hand drum. "But I don't sing," I told her. "Yes, you do," she said with all the firmness of someone who'd been teaching music to children for decades. And so I did. There was always a circle, and within the circle our voices blended and faded, pulled together and came apart. Women's voices rising, changing, joining, improvising, a living sonic fabric. We sang and sang until a soft buzzing, a low murmuring hum rose off every drum in the house in sympathy. Not just the ones we played, all of them. The room had become a resonant chamber, the boundaries between bodies and instruments gently dissolving. The sound lifted up the walls, and so did we. Later, at the end of the night, long after the children fell asleep on the porch and the tables were cluttered with remnants of endless cups of tea, it was time to leave. We sang a final harmony for the benediction, and the family gave us beaded jewelry as a parting gift. Even me, the outsider. A token of appreciation, yes, but also inclusion. That night was one of my first experiences of entering a dream state while awake. Without sleep, without substances, without effort, just rhythm, relationship, and surrender. An altered state held communally. Years later, in a university classroom far from that circle, I tried to explain it. I'd walk in, pick up a marker, and write 3 words across the whiteboard. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. Then I'd ask, other than lifestyle choices, what do these have in common? A few students would catch it. They are all ways of entering altered states. In psychology, we often talk about flow, focused, productive, ego-strengthening immersion. Flow sharpens the self. Trance does the opposite. Trance softens or dissolves the ego. It unravels the boundary of self so something else, spirit, insight, memory, dream, can enter. It's been practiced for millennia, drumming, chanting, rocking, spinning, humming, stillness, not to produce anything, to commune. That night in Alberta taught me more about altered states than anything I read. It showed me that consciousness is porous, that rhythm is a doorway, that community is a container, that music isn't just performance, it's technology. And it left me with a set of questions I didn't yet know how to answer. What changes a human being? What restores them? What dissolves ego enough for insight to rise? Indigenous musicians showed me some of those answers long before I had language for them. Not their practices, not their ceremonies, not their cosmologies. Those are not mine to use or teach. What I learned that night was the human capacity for resonance, for transformation, for being held inside a container of relationship and sound. And that insight stayed with me. But what kept returning wasn't trance, it wasn't altered states, it was healing. I didn't know to call it that yet. But the questions themselves kept following me. Even after I left academia, they threaded through my writing, my teaching, my conversations, quietly, insistently, like something waiting for me to recognize it. I wasn't practicing anything in secret. I wasn't smuggling in other people's traditions. I was trying to be as academic as possible, rigorous, analytical, disciplined, and still this deeper orientation kept resurfacing, not as a technique, not as a practice, but as a pattern. What helps a human being come back to themselves? What allows the psyche to reorganize after rupture? What does real restoration require? A former student, now a dear friend, finally said it aloud. You've been circling around this like a shark for years. And she was right. Not circling indigenous practices, not circling trance, but circling the work of healing itself, long before I ever named it that. Healing wasn't an identity I adopted later. It was embedded in the questions that wouldn't leave me alone. Questions I first encountered in that living room, held in song and relationship years before I understood where they were leading me. So if the line from ethnomusicologist to healer looks unusual from the outside, it is. It isn't straight, but it has a certain coherence. It runs through rhythm, presence, sound, and the dreaming mind, through communities who taught me how consciousness shifts and how we return, through the moments where ego softened just enough for insight to rise. This wasn't a pivot, it was a deepening. And in the videos that follow, I'll keep tracing that line, how sound, rhythm, and the dream state shaped my work long before I knew where it was leading me.